You were looking yesterday at the genesis or origin of selfishness in a human being, and explained it as starting from the time we're very small. And the problem comes from ignorance, lack of knowledge, not stupidity, just a lack of knowledge. We don't have any of the proper knowledge, say the Buddhists. We don't understand how we should behave when we meet things, so the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, etc. We make mistakes, and the mistakes we make are more or less what create the feeling of self in our minds. The feeling of being me comes from our mistakes. And every time we meet with anything interesting, anything we see as having meaning, is going to have this effect. It's going to create a mental response that we refer to as me. It's really just a feeling. In fact, any undue excitement in life, the mind will identify itself as me, the experiencer of that. It is a kind of identification process, and we'll explain how it works on the psychological level. Now, yesterday we looked at rebirth or reincarnation, if you want to use that term, which involves something traveling or passing over from this life into another life, and so on ad nauseam into the future. As it was in the past, so it will continue to be in the future, that kind of thing. It's not too difficult to explain, but you need to understand yourselves a little differently and forget about the body and mind scenario, and forget about the body altogether, because it's not really important in this context, and just think of yourself as a stream of consciousness, a stream of experience. Because essentially that's what the mind is. It's classical Buddhism to understand the mind in this way, as a stream of events. None of them connected in the sense we'd normally understand that, because consciousness itself is not connected. It's like packets of energy, little pulses. They're not physically connected, but they do influence each other, because every moment of consciousness, which is infinitesimally small, it always carries with it feeling, perception, and thought. So you could say that feeling, perception, and thought, which also constitute the mind, are the hand servants, the maids or handmaids or servants of consciousness. They're what give consciousness, present consciousness with the things it then knows, proceeds to know. So each moment of consciousness then also contains or encloses feeling, perception, and thought. So each moment of consciousness, you could say, each individual moment of consciousness is the arising of one individual mind or mind state. And how clear that is. Which means that whenever we experience anything, basically, as mentioned before, the mind is a reaction to the experience. There's a physical experience, and then a mental reaction to it. And that mental reaction is feeling, perception, and thought. So you could also refer to the mind as consciousness, consciousness as the mind. On this level, we can not be too fussy about terms and use consciousness and mind, the words consciousness and mind, interchangeably. So in the rebirth understanding, there has to be something that passes over from one life to another. There's a problem with that, as rebirth people freely acknowledge. In fact, there are two very big problems with it, one more obvious than the other. Rebirth is an invention of the commentators. Although if you read the Buddhist scriptures, if you should be inclined to look into the different Nikayas, because they've all been translated, at least into English and European languages, no doubt into Chinese, into Mandarin also. And you'll see rebirth all over the place. Excuse me. Especially in certain parts of the Buddhist scriptures, the word rebirth will occur often. But you must bear in mind that what you're reading is a translation and not the original Pali language. Now, the word for birth in the original language of Buddhism, Pali, is Jāti. Jāti. And it means birth. It does not mean rebirth. But whenever it gets translated in certain contexts, it always gets translated as rebirth. But apparently there's no word in the Pali language that means rebirth. So there's a big problem for people who want to hang that label onto the Buddha, that he was teaching rebirth or reincarnation. It's been the source of many problems over the years, particularly for Buddhadasa. Because in Thailand in days gone by, a very conservative country, still is largely that way. And Buddhism is very conservative also. There is a Sangha Raja, a head monk. There are even Sangha police who police the monastic order. And they've always taught, the Buddha's teaching has always been interpreted as a rebirth teaching. I think I mentioned this is why. The main reason for Thai people supporting the religion. So, and Buddhadasa came out and said that the Buddha was not teaching rebirth. He was the first one to really do that. And it caused a real storm. Because people don't listen. And they hear not teaching rebirth, there's no rebirth. But he never actually said that. He just said the Buddha was not concerned with rebirth. He didn't say rebirth didn't take place. There was no such thing. He may well have thought that. He may well have known that. I don't know. But he wasn't foolish enough to say it. Although one suspects that on occasion he may have indicated it, that he did believe in that way. And I too once denied it in a Dhamma talk I gave to Chinese people, and really, they didn't like it. They were not happy. So we must be careful with this. Nobody knows for sure. There are examples, and the most famous one I can think of is the Lama Govinda, who was a Tibetan monk. Originally was ordained in this tradition, which is what they call Hinayana, a small vehicle. Tibetan is Vajrayana. There are 3 levels as far as certain people are concerned. Hinayana is the most basic form of Buddhism. Then there's Mahayana, which is a bit fancier. And then you've got the diamond, Vajrayana, which is the most profound. So it's like the ground floor, the first floor, and the roof, or the penthouse, if you like. The Lama Govinda originally was a Theravada or Hinayana monk, and he eventually fell in love with Tibetan tradition and migrated to India. Spent a lot of his life living in northern India, in Darjeeling, in the monastery at a place called Goom, which I remember wandering around once when I was in northern India one year. He claims, or says, and he's probably the most viable, that he had an experience when he was quite young. I think he might already have been a monk when this happened. He was reading a book. Someone gave him a book which they thought he might have an interest in. And as he read it, right from the start, he realized that, well, he was very familiar with this work. And as he turned the pages, he found that he really was coming to know what was on the next page without even bothering to turn the page. So I drew the reasonable conclusion, although the book was actually published before he was born, that he must have been the author of this book in some previous life. Whether he was or not is debatable, but that's what he came to believe, and therefore he was a strong proponent also of the theory of reincarnation or rebirth, and also believed that Buddhism was all about that. Buddhadasa is fairly unique in denying that the Buddha was concerned with it in any way at all. There's one other Sri Lankan monk who's a proponent of psychological rebirth. wrote a very learned treatise on the business of reincarnation, rebirth. But the majority of people who call themselves Buddhist will certainly cling desperately to the idea that they will be reborn in some form. Or other. And we mentioned yesterday there are realms you can re-arise in, but you can understand these places as physical places where you get reborn. Places like hell or heaven, the usual understandings, under the ground, place up in the sky called heaven. The Preta Loka, nobody knows where that is. There is no actual location associated with it, as far as I know. The Asura Guy, the realm of demons, again, nobody really knows where that is, although it's usually placed along with the gods. There are various levels of gods. They don't all exist on the same plane of existence. And apparently the demons also exist along with them. You can also understand that in the psychological sense, and we're going to busy ourselves today looking at the psychology or the psychological form of rebirth, if you want to use that word. Well, it is a theory, and we tried to explain yesterday that it does have origins. You can trace them to some degree. And they seem to come from the Upanishadic texts that followed the Vedas, or kind of like commentaries or additions to the ancient Vedic scripture. The Vedas themselves being really nothing to do with any kind of esoteric thinking or advanced thinking on life after death or any of that stuff. And the oldest of the Upanishads seems to be, or contains the first mention of a theory of rebirth. And that's about 100, maybe 200 years prior to the birth of Siddhartha Gautama. So it's about 2,007 or 800 years ago. Before that, there is no mention of rebirth, and apparently in India there was no belief in it. It was not part of the belief system. Indians were buried like everybody else, or just left to rot or whatever. They weren't cremated in those days either. Cremation was not part of the Indian religion. And there was a belief in a kind of heaven and hell, much as the Christians believe. I think the heaven was referred to as a realm of the ancestors or something like that. When you died, if you were a righteous individual, then you would end up in the realm of the ancestors, along with the gods, various levels of God. The demigods, the gods, they all dwell in different levels, gradually increasing. In what way, I don't know. In height, I suppose. The further up in the sky you are, the greater God you are. Hell was referred to as a house of clay. A house of clay. Both are eternal experiences also. So if you ended up in heaven, that was it. You were there forever and ever, amen, until the universe contracted and went back into the golden egg. And same applied to rebirth into the house of clay, or whatever you want to call it. It wouldn't have been rebirth, I suppose. Because it doesn't fracture the Hindu teaching, because the Hindus believe, and it's in their scriptures, that every human being has something called an Atman. And that if one gets enlightened, this Atman then merges with the great soul, the world soul, the Paramatman, the great Atman. And so the job, as far as a Hindu is concerned, the job to be done is to effect that, to get the small Atman, the small me, if you like, to merge into the great me. Buddhism denies the existence of the me, whether it be small or great. They use a different word, atta, but it has the same meaning as Atman. Before we leave physical rebirth, it does fracture the Buddhist, it does go against the teaching, it seems. The most basic teaching in Buddhism is that everything changes and transforms, with the exception of nirvana. And anything conditioned, anything like me, for instance, I've changed and transformed continually and all the time. And everything that comes into existence does. So to posit something that doesn't, like a self or a soul, goes right against what the Buddha actually taught on a very basic level. Everything changes. There cannot be anything which does not change. Now, some Buddhists who really think about it and have some knowledge outside of the usual will be able to back that up, at least with some kind of argument, in the very ancient Indian knowledge, what they used to call Gupta Vidya. And Gupta was a dynasty, it's about 3,500 years ago, maybe more, in India, in I think southern central India. The Guptas ruled India for quite a long time. And their knowledge apparently was profound. They claimed to understand the function of the universe, to know its age, which they actually set down in writing. It's a fantastically long figure, so many million, skrillion, gabillion years, it can't be pronounced. So there is a time when the universe expands, and there's a time when it goes back into itself, it contracts. And they referred to these as Manvantara and Pralaya. So the Manvantara is the expansion of the universe, and that's when the Atman, if you want to use that term, transmigrates from life to life to life to life to life. So there is a kind of impermanence there, in that there is an end to that change and transformation, that transmigration. So you can refer to that as change and transformation over a very long period of time. It's more difficult if you're dealing with the idea of a self, though. It's difficult to see how you can fit that into a teaching which denies it quite explicitly. The Buddha taught anatta. What is here is not me. It's explicit. You cannot get away from that statement. There have been moves in some Thai monasteries, most notably the Dhamma sect in Bangkok, which is a very rich foundation, I think, very powerful, lots of powerful friends in government. They've made attempts to actually change the meaning of the word anatta as it's understood in the Thai language, thereby making it easier to associate Buddhism with rebirth. Now, Buddhadasa generally tended to look on the idea of reincarnation as being something which was totally unnecessary. As far as he was concerned, he couldn't experience it personally, and so he wasn't really interested in even considering it as any kind of reality. He didn't say it didn't happen. He just was happy to say that, well, Buddhism is not concerned with it. And a certain reading of the Buddhist text would confirm his view. It's not popular with young people anyway, so as the years pass by, one suspects that that belief, that kind of belief, will probably become a thing of the past anyway. But at present, the percentage of Buddhists who believe in rebirth is overwhelming. And what Buddhadasa did consider was the psychological, the arising and passing away into the human mind of the feeling of self, this very abstract sense of being me. If when you think about it, it's almost impossible to describe in sensible terms. What is it? A feeling of being me, or just a blind acceptance that this is me without anything real to back it up? A Buddhist would say there is something real to back it up. Undoubtedly, that a mental reaction does occur when we experience certain things. A certain level of excitement develops, whether it be pleasant or unpleasant, doesn't matter. And that basically is the self. So you can detect it. And because you can detect it, you can learn to control it. Reincarnation from life to life, well, can't do much about that. You can blindly believe in it, in which case you'll behave yourself and try and be a proper human being during the course of this life, hoping all the time that in the next life that's going to pay dividends. That's not a wise approach, because your desire will be, there will be desire behind that, and desire, as long as a human being is ignorant, I'm afraid. Unless we really know how to handle life, how to control the way we live, that's always going to create problems. But you can understand how the sense of self arises into the human mind in dependence on a particular kind of experience, and we can look at the process. It's not easy to grasp if you've not heard it before. I'm not going to use any long Pali words. Always try to avoid that because it confuses people even more. But what we're going to describe is unusual. It's not the sort of thing you would normally stumble upon if you listen to some Buddhist monk talking. Buddhadasa was fairly unique in the way he presented this particular style of teaching. We can look at it and kind of expand it slowly. We can look at the process quickly because it's not difficult to explain. Now, any kind of experiences with the baby that we see as being stimulating, as having meaning. So anything we see, like a sunset, for instance, doesn't have to be a powerful experience. Anything that causes an unnatural desire to arise in the mind, given the fact that human beings are always unmindful, unless they teach themselves to be mindful, then all our experiences are happening in ignorance and are therefore going to have an unnatural response to them. So when we see a sunset, one's perceptions recognize that and told us that it is a sunset, then the feeling will arise as the mind reacts to the sunset, to the seeing of a beautiful sunset. The feeling that arises will be one of stimulation of a pleasant kind. Most people like sunsets, pretty things to look at. And if you've got a camera, probably take lots of photographs of them as they undergo change, go through their performance of producing different effects and colors, until eventually the sun drops far enough below the horizon and the sunset fades away. Most people like sunsets. And so they do create a certain mental response, a vedana, a feeling, which will be stimulating or delightful. Now straight away we're into the realm of the unreal, because we're dealing with something which is being ignorantly understood to start with. We don't know how to react to sense experience, we don't understand ourselves or the world we're living in, so we're experiencing a sunset, and to us the sunset is a real thing. The word sunset represents the reality of the thing we're experiencing, and the sunset will have certain meanings associated with it. Essentially those of the good and the bad, the good and the evil. Well, a sunset will be a good thing. And so the mind will respond to it by producing a corresponding feeling. The feeling will be pleasant, will be stimulating, will be delightful, and therefore desire will arise. And it's all quite natural, this. Even if we weren't ignorant, the mind would work in much the same way. You would see something, or smell, or taste something. The mind would scan it, would perceive it, and then the feeling would arise as either a pleasant or an unpleasant feeling, if ignorance wasn't around. And the response to that would be desire, and just the same. The difference would be ignorance would be missing. And so if we were wise people, Buddhas or something, then we would still experience things in much the same way, but because ignorance wouldn't be around, then we wouldn't be experiencing them ignorantly. And so we wouldn't look at a sunset, but if we did, it wouldn't have the same meaning, of course. It wouldn't have any meaning. It's just nature. You can't eat it. You can't drink it. It's of no use at all. And so it wouldn't cause any mental disturbance of an unusual kind. And the mind would probably just pass away, pass it off, just let it go without bothering too much about it. But the reaction would be basically the same. There would be the seeing of the sunset, and then the feeling arising into the mind of a pleasant kind, and then, a neutral kind in this case. And then desire will arise even towards the neutral feeling. But that would be as far as the business would probably go. But if we're ignorant, then the sunset will create a stimulating feeling, and that's the problem. The feeling, therefore, is not a real feeling in the sense of being true or genuine. It's a feeling which is mixed with ignorance. And the ignorance it's mixed with is those defilements we've mentioned on a number of occasions, those roots of greed, aversion, and delusion. They're mixed up with the experience and they're changing it. They're making it subtly different. They're kind of enhancing the experience, giving it meanings it doesn't have. The meanings essentially are those of good and bad. Anything good in this sense is going to cause desire of a certain kind to arise, because it's going to cause a feeling of stimulation or delight on some level. And so desire will be what they call tanha, craving, craving for stimulation. Something we don't need, it's an abnormal form of desire, and so the result of it eventually is going to be a feeling of me, will be born or will arise into the mind. Now if you track this process, and it's happening all the time in the human mind, it's very fast, it's always the same. Ignorant sense contact, as they call it, the eye seeing a sunset is a sense contact, the eye is meeting a visible object. Consciousness is arising, and then the feeling arises. And then desire arises towards the feeling. Now all that's really happening there, say the Buddhists, is the mind is responding to an experience, something being seen. There is no me involved in that. We just accept that there's always a me. Now there really isn't. And according to this kind of understanding, the me is actually going to arise as a result of having seen a stimulating event like a sunset. It's actually going to come from the experience. There is no me waiting to do the experience, to do the experiencing. So when the feeling arises, when the eye sees the form, there's no problem there. And once the mind gets involved, once sunset is recognized with all the meanings we'd associate with it, the feeling arising is pleasant. That's all that's happening. There is nobody experiencing this. And this is not so easy to deal with. But according to Buddhists, the mind, whenever it experiences, and when it gets involved with an experience, at the beginning of any experience, the mind is pure. It's in its original, pure, untroubled condition. It's not troubled by self-belief or anything else. Any self-belief, any feeling of being me is going to arise as a response to the experience being undergone. But the beginning of the experience is just the mind experiencing. Okay, it's ignorant. It doesn't have knowledge, but neither does it have the feeling of being me associated with it either. It's only when clinging, what they call clinging, takes place. That is, the mind clings or sticks to the thing being experienced. Clinging is called upadana. There are two kinds, as always in Buddhism, wise and unwise clinging. Even Buddhists cling when they experience things. You have to hold something with the mind to experience it. And that's clinging. And it can be wise, it can be unwise. Unwise clinging does nothing. Doesn't create anything peculiar in the human mind. But unwise clinging is precisely what causes the feeling of being me, of being the experiencer of a particular experience, watching a sunset, to suddenly appear. And it's from this point on, in your response to a sunset, that you feel that there is a you experiencing it. This is a reality, say Buddhists. We don't understand in this way because we always assume there is a me. What they're trying to reveal with this kind of teaching is that the self-sense is something that comes as a response to sense experience, but only if you allow the mind to cling to an experience. Clinging is easy to explain if you think of a piece of music. Like you hear some music, and being a musician, or in the past anyway, I can compose to a certain degree, and I know some tricks. They call them hooks in the music trade. All musical compositions have them. Doesn't matter what kind of music is, maybe with the exception of religious music, or even in some cases in religious music too. It's that something about a piece of music, when you hear it, suddenly something catches your attention. It's called a musical hook. A little cadence, a chord change, combination of notes put together in a certain way, catch your attention. And you want to hear it again and again. And so maybe you, if it's a CD, you might buy the CD in order to sit and listen to the whole performance. And what's happened there is your mind is stuck. It's being caught by that little trick, that little musical trick. Your mind is clung. And then you can't stop humming it because you can't really stop. You can't let it go. The sound of the music possesses your mind. This is called clinging. It doesn't matter what it is. It's easy to explain taking musical cadences as an example, because then it makes clinging very obvious. And so you go around humming the tune, trying to remember it, and of course you eventually buy the music. And then you listen to it and listen to it until you get tired of it, until the mind absorbs the whole performance. And then there is no more delight involved, unless you listen. You stop listening to it, maybe listen to it again in another year, and it has a similar effect again. This is what clinging is like. It's the mind kind of taking hold of something, not physically, I'm just doing that to illustrate it, but mentally. The mind is sticking to an experience, and it will do this with a sunset, providing we're ignorant, of course, because sunsets, like a piece of music, they catch our attention. You want to see more. The mind clings foolishly. And that's the moment, say the Buddhists and says the Buddha, that the feeling of me actually appears. In this experience we're mentioning, we're talking about in the beginning, there is nobody experiencing it in truth. But as the experience unfolds, and it's a flash of lightning really in the beginning, the feeling arises in ignorance, so it's a stimulated or delightful feeling. The craving, the desire arises, which is also ignorant, and then the mind clings. Because the desire is ignorant, unless you're very careful, the mind will immediately stick to the object. And once that happens, then the feeling of me enters the mind, becomes noticeable in the mind. We don't know this because we think there's always a self-living life. We just accept that fiction. But you see, you can, if you have the mental strength, if you train your mind and your mindfulness is fast enough, you can actually recognize the truth of this. You can see the self-sense arise, you can experience it. And if you can do that, you can also stop it from rising. So it's controllable. And why is it that when the mind clings, why does that cause the feeling of me to appear? Now this always defeats people. I've been trying to get this across for a long time, but I can't think of any way to do it other than the way I've been explaining it. We think there's always a me. We just accept that. Now the Buddhists say there really isn't. But we don't know that. We think there is. This is me. Forget it. Now the mind is going to react in the way I said to any experience which is meaningful. As long as we are ignorant, there will be a certain kind of feeling which will cause the mind to desire in a foolish or ignorant way. And that will then cause the mind to take hold or cling. Now when the mind clings, as long as we think there's the me, the mind will cling. It will bring with it a feeling of something being mine, being a possession. Because we think there is always a me here, then there is always going to be a mine when the mind clings to things. It is a kind of possession. So it will create a feeling of being something being mine. But the thing to get is that that's what creates the feeling of me also, because the mind then, in a kind of backwards or upside down way, creates the feeling of me after the feeling of mine. First, there's a feeling that something is mine, a sense that this is mine, and then afterwards comes the me. It's usually the other way around, of course. We think there's a me, so there must be a mine, but actually it's opposite. The mind comes first, and then comes the me. There's a possession before there's a possessor, which is pretty strange. But that's the way it works, because we simply think there's always a me. And when the mind clings to anything, it always creates the feeling of something being mine. But in reality, there is no me. It's not a real thing. It's just something we accept. And so there is a mine, and then afterwards there is a me. This is almost, it seems impossible for people to grasp, although it's really quite simple if you can see it. It's one of those curiosities of the way the mind works. It's never quite the way we think it is. So you see a sunset, and ignorance is dominant in your life, and as mentioned, that's not stupidity, it's not a lack of all kinds of knowledge, it's just a lack of basic knowledge. Knowledge of our own true nature will do. You just accept that this is me, that's ignorance enough. The sunset therefore provokes a stimulated or delightful feeling. A delightful feeling, like any pleasant feeling or delightful feeling, will create desire. The desire is unwise, so they call it tanha. Kind of thirst for stimulation arises into the mind, and that then promotes clinging. You could say that the desire and the clinging, they're really the same thing. It's just that clinging is a stronger form of desire. This desire becoming something, once the mind clings, you can't defeat the desire. Until the mind clings, when it's just, you feel desired for a cream donut or a cup of coffee or a can of Coca-Cola, you can't turn that off. You can defeat that. But once the mind clings to the idea of a cup of coffee, a can of Coca-Cola, or a cream donut, then you're going to do what you have to do to get that, and then in order to enjoy it, because the self-sense will then have appeared in the mind, and once the self-sense appears, that's the end of the business. You can't do anything about it. And once contact arises, in the case of a sunset, you see it, the feeling arises, as desire arises towards the sunset, you can deflect your mind away from the sunset. You can go and do something else. You can sit down and meditate or find something else to occupy your time with. And then the feeling of me will not be born. It will not arise into your mind. Even though we, being ignorant, will still assume there is a me, there really won't be. And so we won't have the normal disturbance to deal with because of that. So once there's desire, then the mind clings, and that curious projection, that kind of reverse projecting takes place. Mind clings to things as mine. That's what creates the feeling of me. Now there's a me experiencing desire for a better view of a sunset or something like that. And so what's going to happen now is you're going to do something to get the object of desire. And with a sunset, that will mean taking photographs or getting into a better place in order to see it more clearly or whatever. And so you'll move, you'll do things deliberately to get the object of your desires. That means speaking sometimes. You have to make deliberate noises to get where you want to go. Might be a big crowd of people. Excuse me, can I get through, please? You'll be making deliberate speech. You'll also be thinking. You may need to think in a deliberated way in order to make the body move and to make the organ of speech produce words. And you'll need to move physically. You'll have to make activities known. This is basically what they call karma. You'll be doing deliberate things to get something you don't need but which you desire, because it's going to stimulate you more and more the more you pay attention to it. In this particular style of teaching, it's not called karma, it's called becoming. And the Pali word is bhava, coming into existence. Now what happens when the mind clings is a sense of self arises. There's a feeling of being the experiencer of this particular experience, which really wasn't there before, in truth. Now it is. But it's not complete, it has to develop itself. And the things we do to get the object of our desire is what's going to cause that feeling of self to increase, to grow up in the mind. It's like the mind identifying itself as the experiencer of a beautiful sunset. The more things you have to do, the more the mind will develop the full sense of self into the ego, into the I am, the experiencer of this particular experience. They call it becoming. It's a bit like, do you think of the mind as being rather like an actor? As long as we're ignorant, we're always acting different roles during the course of our lives. Now the watcher of a sunset, you can come into existence as a drinker of a glass of whiskey, as the watcher of a movie, as the eater of a delicious meal. The self-sense is always born from stimulating experience, or always arises in the mind as a result of being stimulated, the mind being stimulated. So the mind is a little like an actor, which is constantly changing its appearance, changing its character, as it experiences different things. Because every time it creates the feeling of me, every time it creates the ego sense, it's always different, it's never the same. And given the consumer system, we can arise, we can develop, we can become anything at all. You can also become an angry person, depressed person, depending on experience. But as we're always seeking stimulation, then we tend to be always come into existence in more positive ways. But we are always doing it. A long, long time ago, there was a comedian in England, a funny man called Tommy Cooper. But Tommy was funny. Apparently he was a real miserable so-and-so in his life. He was very mean. He wouldn't give anything away. But he was a very funny man. And one of his acts, part of his act, was to bring a box on stage full of hats, different kinds of hats. And what he would do, he'd act out a melodrama all on his own. He'd take all the parts. And every time he changed character, he'd stick a different hat on his head. And the funny part was, of course, that he'd make a mess of it, and he'd get all tangled up and confused. It was hilarious. But we do the same thing, really, with our lives, right? Throughout life, we're always, as it were, changing our persona in dependence on the things we experience. So we're always becoming this or becoming that kind of a person, in dependence on something stimulating or whatever it happens to be we're experiencing. You come into existence as the experiencer of a particular experience. But that only lasts as long as your interest in the experience lasts. Sunsets don't last forever, they come and they go quite quickly. So the me who arises into the mind in dependence on a sunset will only last for so long, like the little baby with the feeding experience. It's just the same thing. But you see, being analyzed and explained step by step. The same thing happens to a baby as happens to us now, and happens all the time if we let it. So we're always coming into existence. And once the sunset goes, then the stimulation ceases or fades away, and the feeling of being me will fade away also. And being fixated on things like on stimulation, and also being fixated on being me. One of our problems is we like to feel that we exist, that there is a me living life. We enjoy it. It's what we are. But it's really dependent entirely on our experiences. The more stimulating the experience, the more intense the feeling of being alive, you might say. And so we become fixated on seeking stimulation and on this coming into existence process. And so when you feel the ego sense fading away, it's as if it arises into the mind, and when it does, and it arises fully, the Buddhists say it is born. That word Jāti, becoming, is the condition or gives rise to birth. Just as the feeling gave rise to desire, desire gave rise to clinging, clinging to becoming, and becoming will also give rise to the full sense of I am, which is called birth. And to keep that very simple, in the moment that you get the object of your desire, you get into the best position, there's the glory of the sunset shining away before you. You can snap away to your heart's content, maybe compose some poetry at the same time if you wish. You've come into existence, you've been born fully as the experiencer of a sunset. In that moment, the self-sense has come to its fullest extent. The Buddhists also say that your ignorance has grown up in your mind to its fullest extent. And as long as you stay interested in the sunset, then the mind will maintain that feeling of being me. The self is born, it will then maintain itself. They call it aging. Like we think of aging as being physical aging. I'm getting old, we think of myself as aging. But even the mind, the things the mind creates, can age. Even the ego sense can be born, can age, can also die. Because when the sunset disappears or ceases to be attractive, then your interest in it will fade away, it will no longer stimulate. And so you could say the sunset is going to be born, age, and die also. When you first pay attention to the sunset, you could say for you the sunset is born in that moment. Not physically, mentally. It possesses your mind, and it ages, it develops, and that's like an aging process. It also fades as the sun sinks lower below the horizon. It's not so strong, it's not so attractive, not so vibrant. This is referred to by Buddhists as aging also. And when the sunset is over and night falls, then you can say the sunset, it would be quite reasonable to say that sunset has died, odd though it sounds. And therefore the me who arises as a response to it, the mental response, also is born, ages and dies. And the ego sense arises fully in the beginning of the experience when you get into position, the best position to be thrilled and spilled by what you call a sunset, then you could say you are mentally born in that moment as the experiencer of the sunset. And just as the sunset loses its hold on your mind as it fades and the colors aren't so brilliant anymore, so your mind, the feeling of self fades with it, and that is the aging of the ego sense. And then when the sunset disappears, the stimulation disappears, the me disappears along with the stimulation. The ego sense is born, it ages, and it dies, just as the experience could be said to be born, to age, and to die. And every time you are born in this way mentally, the feeling of being me comes into existence in the mind. Then we also have to experience or are confronted by the fact of birth, aging, sickness and death. Life becomes ours. We are born as the experiencer of life. We're going to die someday, so the subtle fear of death possesses our minds. And the subtle fear of aging and sickness, because it's not being sick which is dukkha so much, it's the fear of it more than anything else. Things like cancer or AIDS are constant threats in human life. Now this process repeats itself over and over. When the sunset fades away, your mind will depress, of course. You've been interested and stimulated by observing this beautiful phenomenon called the sunset, but now it's gone. And so you probably immediately, without thinking about it, gravitate towards something else which will hold your attention and therefore sustain the feeling of being me, boost the feeling of being me once more. You feel depressed, you feel a little mental depression, not depression in the clinical sense. It's just once the mind's been stimulated, it must come back down. And when it comes back down, it doesn't feel quite so good. Sometimes we call it feeling bored. And so we don't like to be bored, because feeling bored causes an unpleasant sensation to dominate the mind. Feeling is unpleasant. Nobody likes that. Everybody wants to be happy in a nice, stimulated way. So we'll seek for some way to do that. Okay, the sunset's gone, but there are many things you can do. You might want to go watch a movie. You have to go back a few years to do that. There's a movie house just down the road. You don't fancy drinking or anything, or a meal, you're not hungry, there's nothing much else you feel like doing. There's a movie house down the road. And it just happens to be playing a movie that you like, that you would like to see, which has been advertised in the local paper. If you've read the review of the film and you know more or less what it's about, and you think this would be well worth sitting through. And so your mind was a little depressed. You maybe started to feel bored because the sunset was no longer stimulating you. And so now you're going to seek some other form of stimulation to boost the mind again, to bring the self-sense, to strengthen that feeling of being me. You're going to start looking for something else to do. You're going to come into existence as the experiencer of a movie. And like this man Tommy Cooper putting the hats on his head, you're going to do the same thing now. You put the hat on your head of being the experiencer, the enjoyer of a sunset. Now the sunset's gone, you take that hat off, and you're going to put another hat on your head, the experiencer of a movie. And so you walk down the road, you stand outside, look at the notice board. Yes, this looks all right. Get your money out, make sure you've got enough, no problem there. Oh, you go in, you pay your money at the ticket window to the nice lady inside the ticket window, and she presses a button, the ticket comes out. There's a counter there. You take the ticket, and then a young lady comes and takes you upstairs to the balcony or wherever you're going to sit, and you plonk yourself down in the chair and wait for the movie to start. The same process will have spun in your mind. The same thing will have happened. At the beginning of this experience, the sunset experience, is disappeared completely. It's like the mind is wiped clean because it takes an interest in something different. At the very beginning of the experience, again, the mind kind of goes back to its normal state, to its original state. There is no feeling of self once more. It disappears completely. And you're going to do the same thing. You see the cinema house, and you move towards it. You see what's being shown there. Your eye is seeing something, and the mind is going to respond to what's being seen. What you see is the name of a movie, and you'd like to see this movie. You know what it's about because you read the review, and you can remember that. So when the scanner of perception gives you more and more information, and as it does, so the object becomes more meaningful for you. Yes, you would like to see this film. It gives you a pleasant feeling. You look at the notice board, it's got some picture of which is supposed to represent something happening in the movie, and this looks really interesting. Catches your attention in a big way. The same thing's happened. The eye has seen something, and then the mind is responding. A feeling arises straight away. The feeling is a pleasant feeling, a stimulated, expectant, stimulated feeling, just as it was with the sunset. And when the feeling arises, there's always desire arises immediately. And if the mind's foolish, the feeling will be foolish or mixed with ignorance, and so it'll be stimulating or delightful again. And so the desire will be tanha, will be craving for the delightful. If the delight is going to be wise, then we have to be reacting normally to experience. Desire arises normally to normal experiences, to things that don't stimulate, but are the things that we need to stay alive. But we're not interested in those. We're interested in being stimulated, and a movie is going to do that. So desire arises towards the feeling coming, growing up in the mind as a response to having seen the movie, having seen the notice posted outside the cinema, and perception taking place. The feeling is a stimulated feeling, desire towards it arises, and the mind will cling straight away, unless you stop it. Because you've already decided you want to see the movie, okay, the mind has clung straight away. It's that curious thing is going to happen again. When you see the movie, you see the notice board, and the feeling and the desire arise. It's just the mind responding ignorantly to something being seen. There is no me involved in that at all. That me that experienced the sunset has disappeared completely. And then the mind clings as a result of the desire. It's like you make a decision, you could say. The mind clings. Now, because we think there's always a me, when the mind clings to anything foolishly, then it creates the feeling of something being mine. It's like you take possession. The film becomes mine in a sort of abstract way. When that happens, in that create the feeling of me also appears in the mind as a result of it, feeling that this is mine. If we didn't have the belief that this was me, or didn't accept that there was a me living life, then when the mind clung, that would not happen. The mind would cling, but there would be no feeling of anything being mine, because there would be no ignorant understanding that this was me. When there's a me, there's a mind, but the me is not real. That's the point I'm trying to make. The mine is, the feeling of something being mine actually happens. And so in a sort of strange reverse projection, it also creates the feeling in the mind of being me. But it's a kind of naked thing, this me, like something that hasn't got any meaning. You're going to watch the movie, but the you who's going to watch the movie has yet to appear. What's happening with clinging is a kind of feeling of being the experiencer, but it has to grow up, it's not complete. So you have to do things to see the movie. You need to go into the place, so you have to make a decision in your mind. You have to think, get your feet to move, walk up steps, go into the foyer, go to the ticket office, and then you have to speak. One in the balcony, please, madam. So you have to say that. So we're producing karma again, deliberate activity, just as the baby does when it feels desire towards an experience. It creates karma also. It's this very desiring something is karma. And the things the baby does when it's pleased, when it wants to attract its mama's attention, so she'll react to it in the way she did before. The baby is producing deliberate activity, even as a tiny baby. And something we do throughout our lives to get what we want rather than what we need. Nobody needs a film, a movie. But we do at this moment, so it's the same thing happening. Once the clinging arises, once the mind clings, then the feeling of being me also arises into the mind. And then you do the things necessary to get the object of your desire. You deliberately ask, you think, you speak, you act. You get the ticket, and then the young lady takes you up to the balcony, sits you down, and you wait for the movie to start. You haven't quite been born yet, but you've come into existence, like Tommy Cooper with his hats. Now you become the experiencer. The mind has identified itself as the experiencer of the movie. And when the movie starts, you could say you are born in that moment as the me who's going to watch the movie. Actually, movies are a lot more complicated in this sense, in that they're full of stimulating and depressing moments, because they're meant to do that. It's like a story made real on celluloid. You're watching something which is completely fictional, has no reality at all. But to us it does, of course. We believe in it. And so it can play with our emotions, and sometimes the parts of the movie are very stimulating, sometimes they're depressing. Sometimes the hero is winning, the goodies are winning, and then they're losing, and then they look as if they're going to be defeated completely. But in Hollywood, the goodies always win. In reality, they never do, of course, simply because they are good. There are lots of ups and downs in a movie, and anything, because those ups and downs are always going to be either stimulating or depressing in an unwise way, then it's kind of, we go sit and watch a movie, we think it's me, just as we think it's the same me living life throughout life. But even if you sit and watch a movie for 2 hours, there'll probably be loads and loads of egos entering the mind. There'll be lots of yous actually experiencing that movie. Because every meaningful event will create the same response I've just described twice. And so the ego sense will arise into the mind time and again during the course of a movie. Now you'll be pleased, now not so pleased, now stimulated, now depressed, and so on and so forth. Now dewy-eyed, now angry, now irritated, as the movie unfolds its story. It will create endless feelings of self in the human mind, just as life does. If we don't control it, this process happens even to the slightest experience can do it. You want a cup of coffee, you want to smoke a cigarette, the you who smokes the cigarette will be born from the desire you feel towards smoking. You want to drink a glass of spirits or wine, then the you who drinks it will be born from the experience. Just as the mind is born from experience, so the feeling of being me is born from the experience. You can compare it, before we finish, for ease of understanding, to a physical pregnancy. There's always a moment in pregnancy where it begins, and that's the fertilization of the egg, I suppose, by the male sperm. You could compare the moment when feeling of a stimulated kind arises into the mind. If it's not dealt with wisely, if you don't use a contraceptive, then there's going to be a pregnancy, but this pregnancy will be mental. And then the desire, the clinging, the becoming will be like the fetus developing in the physical womb of the female womb. Only this will be happening in the mind. It'll be like a little infant ego growing up in the mind, the cells dividing, the arms appearing, the legs appearing, and all the little bits that an infant needs to be born into the world. Only it will be mental. And when that mental infant, that ego, is developed enough, just as the child in the womb has everything it needs, it's got all its limbs, the top of its head is still soft, although the bone is nearly closed, it's ready to be born, it comes down the birth canal, it begins to experience life. It's the same with the ego. Once the ego has grown up in the mind, once the pregnancy, the mental pregnancy is complete, then the ego sense is born to experience the world. You experience the world in a selfish sense. And then you have to experience dukkha as long as that ego sense persists. I think the message is clear enough. Maybe the actual details of it aren't so easy to grasp, but the message is clear enough. The Buddhists are telling us the basic truth of life. Life is a process of anicca. It is void of any entity which abides. The self-sense is not a reality in the sense of being something which is always here throughout life. It arises, it passes away in dependence on certain kinds of experiences being indulged in. And those experiences are always the ones that people like to indulge in, because they make life worth living. I haven't always been a monk, I've always been ascetic. I've been around. If I told you some of the things I've done in my life, you'd be horrified. So I'm not going to. I'll keep them a secret. There's not much that I haven't experienced one way or another. Life is full of stimulation if you want it to be, and I used to seek it all the time like everybody does. I went to India years and years ago. I didn't go there to look at temples. I was remotely interested in Hinduism, but India is the land of desire. The British called it that. How true that is. And you can find the sort of stimulation I was interested in quite easily. And that's what I did during the first trip. First time I was in India, it was just an hedonistic experience. I sought stimulation of the senses continually, and in the ways I like to seek stimulation of the senses. So during that trip, which lasted about 6 or 7 months, the number of times the ego sense came into existence in my mind in response to the experiences I was continually seeking were numberless. How many times in the course of one human lifetime does the ego sense arise and pass away? We think there's one me living life. I was born, I'm going to get old, and it's me that will die and maybe transmigrate in some way. But how many times in reality, if what the Buddhists say is true, is the ego sense actually born into the mind? And remember, every time there is a feeling of self dominating our minds, then there's also the problem of being alive becomes ours. We get the disturbances associated with being alive. All the ups and downs of life are happening to me. I'm going to die one day. I'm going to get sick one day, God forbid, but it will happen. I have to do this, I have to do that. There are many things I don't want to do, but I have to do them. If you can get rid of the self-sense, then this process stops. The mind does not create this illusion of being me, and then it's just the mind that experiences life. Then the ups and downs of life are still there, but they're not yours, they don't bother you. The consciousness functions very differently then. The feeling of being alive is very different. That feeling of loneliness is not there. Most of us would deny that we are lonely, but this, I'm afraid, is absolutely true. As long as we feel there is a me, we separate ourselves from nature. You think of nature as Mother Nature, and if you ever experience that feeling of absorbing back into nature, and the wonderful feeling of belonging that comes with that, then there's no loneliness for such people. But for such as us, who believe there is a me living life, and who are continually strengthening that illusion by our very activities, then loneliness is a great reality of life in the modern world, as it was in the time of the Buddha. You'll always have that loneliness. You'll always be running away from it. We'll always be afraid of death. We'll walk in the valley of the shadow of death and be afraid of death until the day we do die. It doesn't have to be like that. You can control this process. The Buddha didn't devise anapanasati just to experience piti and sukha, to have the mind blissful or full of joy. They're just steps along the way. The main aim of the practice was to sharpen the mind to such an extent that if you couldn't become an enlightened being, or you didn't have what it was to go all the way with the practice, you could get your mindfulness sharp enough and your knowledge deep enough to begin to turn away from the siren call of consumerism and maybe control your responses to life a little more wisely. And as you went through life, increasingly so. And then the self-sense would not invade the mind so often, and maybe you could control it completely. And then the mind would become very peaceful, placid, and what the Buddhists call cool. It would stop thinking to a large degree. All the anxiety, fear, doubt, worrying about the future, remembering the past, all the things we do to escape from the present moment would be gone. And you'd live your life more or less in the present. You know, in the rebirth, the physical rebirth understanding, you're born into different realms. Into hell, into heaven, into the Asura Gai, the demon realm, or the Preta, the hungry ghost realm, into the animal realm, also into the human realm. It's not really a true human birth, because when you're born you're ignorant, so you don't know how to behave as a human being. But you can be born into the human realm, you can maintain yourself in the true human realm. Function as a true human being if your mindfulness is good enough. You can control the process I just mentioned. If you don't, it will control you. And you'll be born in this way, born in that way, and the mind will continually come into existence as this me or that me, experiencing this experience, being stimulated by this, depressed by this, etc., etc., etc. So anapanasati, the final aim of it, or one of the main aims, is to give us the power to control life so it doesn't control us. It's about controlling feeling or a reaction to feeling. It's always desire. We feel desire towards feeling on any level. Even neutral feeling causes a desire, because a neutral feeling is preferable to an unpleasant feeling. We're always responding to it. If we're not wise, well, we just respond blindly. So the mind goes through the convolutions I've just described. But you can control your response to feeling, and it's not that difficult to do. All you have to do is keep the mind away from stimulation, from delight, from excitement. The problem is, again, that that's what most people want. They want to be stimulated, delighted, excited. So it's not so easy to do that, unless you really feel the need to change the way you function as a human being. And if you don't feel it now, through practicing meditation, even once a day, who knows, that can have a profound effect on some people. Well, you might not feel too inclined to live a very ascetic lifestyle now, denying yourself these stimulating experiences to a large extent. Maybe in the future you might come to live that way, quite naturally. And then the still mind, the silent mind, can be yours most of the time. The benefits of that are enormous. It's not that it feels good, it does feel good. You wake up in the morning, you always feel pretty chipper. There's no depression really, no early morning irritation. Always look forward to the day. You sleep well, your health is good. If your mind is healthy, your body will be healthy too. There's a lot to be got from meditation, besides becoming fully enlightened. A lot of benefits to be derived. But the process to be controlled is the one we just mentioned. And the whole business, at least to some extent, of anapanasati is aimed at giving us the power to do that. We think there is a me, we just accept it. The Buddhists are telling us that this is an illusion. If you know what the feeling of being me is like, and you can know that simply by seeking a stimulating experience and watching how the mind reacts, it becomes hot and busy. The greater the stimulation, the greater the mental heat, the greater the dukkha, the Buddhists would say. But that dukkha is not different from the feeling of self. Basically, it's the mind identifying itself as the experiencer, as the me who's experiencing some stimulation, some anger, or whatever. So you know how the mind is just by remembering how you feel when you're angry, for instance, or irritated. You know how the mind feels when the self-sense possesses it in truth. And if you can restrain yourself or get your meditation to work, you can also know how the mind feels when it is not possessed by the feeling of self. And then you can make your own decision. You can compare the two states, the two experiences, and decide which one you think is preferable. It's really no contest. There are lots of ups and downs in a movie. Okay. There are lots of ups and downs. Guess what it says? Shut your trap. There's more in heaven and earth than is included in my philosophy, that's for sure. Anyway, come on, it's getting late. Must be nearly 11 o'clock. Pubs are shut.